This is not so much a stored procedure as the code to produce a stored procedure. A stored procedure is SQL code, more or less like a batch file, the .sql files we've been looking at. But it's also like a function in that it has a function header and a function body. And the stored procedure is saved along with a database. If you look at the top, you can see in the phpMyAdmin, it's associated with the test database right now, and we have it in the SQL tab before ready to run. If we look at it literally under the magnifying glass, basically the first line isn't part of creating the stored procedure. It's a matter of dropping the stored procedure from its place of storage associated with the database, and it basically says drop procedure if exists, insert genre, where insert genre is the name of our stored procedure. And then we need to set a delimiter, and we set the delimiter to $$, and the reason for this is within the stored procedure we're going to have a number of SQL commands, and the delimiter for the SQL commands is going to be a semicolon, and by default the delimiter for this create procedure is also going to be a semicolon, so there'll be a major conflict there. So we basically want to delimit the create stored procedure with $$, so it can continue delimiting the commands with semicolon. They'll just be treated as characters. So we have create procedure insert genre, the name of the stored procedure. Then we have two parameter definitions, and the first part of the parameter definition is a direction. So we have an N indicating that p_name is an input parameter, and then the third part after the direction and the name is the parameter type, and we have varchar 100, and then we have a comma and the next parameter, and we have a number of commas separating a number of parameters, and the direction of this parameter is out, which means it's going to be returned from the stored procedure. The name is ID and the type is int. And then we have the body of the stored procedure, and it's delimited much like Pascal or Ada, with a begin and an end. So we have begin, the body, and then we have insert into genre, the field name, and the value of p_named, which is our pass parameter. And then we do the informational function last insert ID and set that into the ID parameter, which is an out. And set is used for setting parameters, and declare is used for declaring local parameters, although we don't declare any local parameters. And then we have our end to end the stored procedure, and the $$ to indicate that it's the end of the code we're putting out. And then we switch the delimiter back to a semicolon for normal SQL tab processing. You can create and run stored procedures in phpMySQL or MyAdmin. A lot of people on the internet seem to think you can't, but you can. But it doesn't handle them very well. Like, you can't see where it's stored. You can't get a list of your stored procedures, and it's kind of frustrating that way. There are better tools for creating them and running them for sure. Well, if we go down to the Go button and run this, it asks us, do we really want to drop this stored procedure, and say OK. And now it's created the stored procedure, and then once again the lameness of phpMyAdmin is it doesn't really tell you that it succeeded. But one way we can test whether this worked is to simply call it from the SQL tab of the myadmin. And the format of that is just using the keyword call, and then you have the stored procedure name and the first parameter, which is the input parameter that's musical, which is a genre we want to input. And then we use a local variable, ret ID, in order to get the return value. And the @ sign isn't like an address or something like that, which you might think based on previous experience. The @ sign is just a conventional way of defining local variables within stored procedure type calls. And for instance, if you were declaring local variables, you could use declare @ loc1 and so on. But all we do after we call this stored procedure is we do a select on the local variable, which should display the value we got returned. So if we press go to run this, you see we get a amount of time the query took, which is really not much. And then the return ID we got back was 18, which sounds about right because I've been adding a lot of genres. But what we really want to do is execute a stored procedure using the MySQL connector/net, since this whole series is about connector/net. So we've already done the first two steps in that direction. We've created the stored procedure, and we've tested the stored procedure using PHP myadmin. And now we need to write the client code to interface with the stored procedure. And basically what you need for that is to link the name of the stored procedure via MySQL command, then set the command type of MySQL command to storage procedure, and then set up the parameter collection. The parameter collection is what's used to interface with the parameters defined on the stored procedure, which we had 2. And then you need to execute the command, probably via execute non-query. I've seen other executes, but this is the one that really makes the most sense. And then you want to retrieve the output information, if any, via the parameter collection, since we have an out parameter on the stored procedure. And in order to do this, we're using the same program we've used for the last 3 videos or so, that allows us to add genres to the genre table, and when it first comes up, displays all the genres that we've already input. And that code hasn't changed, so we don't really need to look at the form load. We just need to look at the add genre button event handler, which is now adding genres via the stored procedure. So if we look at this, once again we get the genre name from the text box, and if the genre name is empty, we just pop up a message box that says you need to type one in. But now the code is entirely different. We instantiate a new MySQL command, and we give it as the first parameter, which used to be the SQL string, the name of the stored procedure, which is insert genre. And then we have our connection variable, which we've defined at form load time. And then we set the command type of the MySQL command object to command type.stored procedure to let the system know we're dealing with a stored procedure. And then we start creating our parameter collection. And the first one we add is the p_name, which is the input variable, and we associate this with the string we've just gotten from the text box, since it's an add with value. And then we just do a regular add. You can actually do an add with value for this too, but it makes more sense to just do a regular add, in my opinion. And you have the ID parameter, and the type of that ID parameter is MySQL dbtype.int32. So this establishes the parameter and its type. And then you can set the direction for the p underscore name, and you can set that to parameter direction input, but it defaults to input, so we don't really have to do that. But for the output parameter, we definitely have to have the cmd.parameters and then specify the parameter collection member, which is $ID, and then dot direction, and then set that direction equal to parameter direction dot output. If you don't do this, you'll get an error. And you'll notice for all the parameter collection item definitions, we have a question mark in front of them. And this is much like the @ sign. You can actually get away with not using the @ sign for local variables in recent versions of MySQL, but you absolutely have to have a question mark before the parameter names in the parameter collection, or you'll also get an error. So this is just another convention that I found really confusing. You know, I'm going, why are there all these question marks here? But essentially it's just a convention for defining parameters within the parameter collection. You have to have the question mark to define it. It's a lot like the $sign in PHP. You know, all variables in PHP are $sign variable name. But then in order to execute the stored procedure, we do command object, MySQL command object dot execute non-query. And then in order to get the parameter value back, we use cmd.parameters quotation mark question mark ID quotation mark closed square bracket, which references the specific item in the parameter collection. And dot value tells us to get the value of that parameter. And then we need to do a convert to int32 to make it into a integer and put it in our local integer variable. And then we just need to create our list box line, which is a concatenation of the genre name we input and the ID we got back from the last insert ID function variable in the stored parameter. And we add this line to our list box, and we're pretty much done. We just clear out the text box and set the focus in the text box so we can type in our next genre to be added. So if I compile and run this, I'll bring this down a bit, and you notice if we look at the input parameters, we have our musical 18, which is the last one we added. And say, I'm running out of ideas for genres here, but say Travis McGee. There actually were 2 Travis McGee movies. So if we get one of those 2, this genre applies. And we do add genre. You see that clears out the field and the genre got added. And if we look at our list box, it has indeed been added with the auto increment ID of 19. So the code does work, and you can interface with a stored procedure using this code, and we're going to look at that in even more detail in the next video. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a lot, and I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe.